Afterthoughts, Episode 3. Hi, and welcome back to Afterthoughts. I'm your host, Paul Steele. I'm also the senior pastor at Bethlehem Church in Austin, Minnesota. Afterthoughts is the podcast of Bethlehem Church where we go beyond the Sunday sermon, where we want to talk about things that were related to the sermon, whether it's questions, whether it's additional information that didn't quite make it into the sermon. This past week, we talked about the importance of being present, that in order for you to be part of a community, in order for you to be part of a church, you need to be there. You need to show up. And we looked at Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25. Now, we know that for relationships to succeed, if a relationship has any hope of lasting any length of time, the people involved in that relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a friendship, or even if it's a work relationship, that there has to be a commitment or at least a desire on the part of the people involved in that relationship to be there, to make that relationship somewhat of a priority, to value that relationship. And the same is true with the church. The church, and right now I'm not necessarily talking about the big universal church. What I'm talking about is the local expressions of the church, these small communities of faith, these small Christian communities, that they require the presence of individuals for them to complete the task that God has called us to do. That it requires our presence. And so what is the task that God has placed upon the church? What are we called to do? Well, ultimately, what we're called to do is to go and make disciples. That our task is to bring people into the covenant people of God by making them disciples of Jesus. So we're disciple making. And that requires at least two parts. It requires bringing people who have no relationship with Jesus into a relationship with Jesus. And then it requires the intentional spiritual formation, discipleship, whatever word that you want to use there, of people to become more like Jesus. That's what we're called to do. So we're called to evangelize, to bring people into the community. And then we are called to bring people, as they become part of this community, to help them mature so that they become more and more like Jesus. That's what the church is about. So often what we have done within our culture is that we've made church just another consumer good where we go church shopping to find the best fit for us. And once that church community, once that Christian community no longer meets our expectations or what we desire, then we feel like, oh, we can go and find a new one that does meet our expectations, that does have the things that we find valuable, right? Now, the problem with that is then the focus of the church then doesn't become how we can join them to do what God has called us to do, so that we are joining our skills and our abilities and our passions and our desires with them to do what God has called us to do, and to assist them in the calling that God has placed within the church. But rather, now the focus of the church then is, well, do they meet my needs? Do they live up to my expectations? Do they fulfill what I want? And that's not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church isn't necessarily there to serve you. The purpose of the church is for you to find a place, a community, a group of people where you can become a part of, so that you can live out the calling that God has on your life with these other individuals. And I think that is part of what we see here in this passage from the book of Hebrews. Now, granted, the situation in the first century is radically different than the situation that we find ourselves here in 21st century America, right? Because most of the churches within the first century, they're house churches. They're small. They may be up to 35, 40 people within a house church, and that would have been large. But now we have these big buildings, and we have churches that range up into the thousands, and we have this choice because we have several different, a dozen, 24 different churches that we can choose from just within our local community. That's not even counting the surrounding areas of where we can drive to. And so it is a radically different situation where, on the one hand, in the first century, and this would be true for a lot of the world, that even today, that they didn't have all the different options. Like, they may have one or two options within their local community. There are one or two options of local expressions of the church that they can choose from, that they can be a part of. And then they're committed to that group, whether it's quote unquote a good fit for them or not. And here it's easy for us not to commit to a group because we have the freedom, we have the luxury of being able to go down the street to find a better quote unquote fit. And I think there's a lot of dangers to that because, again, it puts the focus on us and our desires and what we're looking for, and making sure that these churches are meeting our needs and our expectations, and not for us to find a place that we can use our talents and our abilities, but also a place where we can find ways to encourage others, and then a group of people who can in turn encourage us. So again, as we look here at Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25, I think the writer of the book of Hebrews helps us understand the importance of making a commitment to a local church, to a specific church community or Christian community, as we follow Jesus. That this becomes a crucial part for our discipleship, right? Okay, so let's just take a look at Hebrews chapter 10, and I'm actually going to start back in verse 21. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with a sincere hearts, fully trusting him, for our guilty consciences have been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works, and let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. So as we take a look at this, and the reason why I want to start back at verse 21 is that in his book, A Call to Commitment, William Lane talks about how kind of the background information for this passage is found in that the peace offering. That in the peace offering, what people are remembering and celebrating is the fact that God has established or has made peace with them as a people. So back in the Old Testament with the Old Covenant, when when the peace offering was offered, what that meant is that God had confirmed his covenant with the people of Israel. So Israel becomes his covenant people, and he's at peace with them. Now, with that as the background, the writer of Hebrews here says, okay, because we have peace with God, because this has happened, because we are now God's covenant people, then we can go into the presence of God. We can worship God together. Our consciences have been cleansed. We have been washed. We are his people. We can be confident of all of this. And this reminds us, or this tells us, that as God's covenant people, one of the expectations is that we set time aside to worship God, that we praise him and that we thank him, and that we come together to do this. That as God's covenant people, we make a priority of worshiping him, the one who has established a covenant with us, who has established peace with us, who has made a treaty with us. That's kind of the idea behind the idea of a covenant. So a covenant, the best way that we can understand that is a treaty. So God has made a treaty with us, and we worship him, and we praise him, and we thank him. And what we see here in this passage then is that this celebration, that this worship that happens, that this expectation of God's people is something that we do together. It's something that we do with one another. So as we look here, one of the phrases that just jump out at us is the two words, let us. And verse 22, let us go right into the presence of God. Verse 23, let us hold tightly without wavering. Verse 24, let us think of ways. Verse 25, let us not neglect our meeting together. Let us. See, these are things that we are to do with one another. This is a community activity. Our relationship with God is on the one hand, it is a personal relationship with God because God has dealt with us as individuals. But ultimately, part of what salvation is about and part of what this new covenant is about is God creating a new covenant people. And for us to truly experience salvation, for us to truly experience discipleship, requires us to be part of God's people, to make that a priority. And so in verse 23, he says, let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. So let us hold securely, let's secure this. Let's make it tight. Let's make sure that it's not going anywhere. Without wavering. Let's not doubt here. Let's not give up here. Let's not second guess ourselves. Let's make this secure. The hope that we have. Now I want us to think about this reality, is that when do we tend to lose hope? Well, we tend to lose hope when we feel isolated, when we feel all alone. That's one of the downsides, of the stay-at-home stuff that we've experienced with COVID, right? That we've stayed at home and we've kind of isolated ourselves. So we see this spike in suicides and spike in abuse and spike in all these things that point to being isolated, being depressed, feeling like there is no hope. So if we're going to hold on securely to the hope that we have in Jesus, well, that requires us then to be together, to encourage one another, to remind each other what God is doing in our lives, to be there, to support one another. And that becomes even more important as we spend those times, because inevitably we all spend time alone. We all find ourselves isolated from time to time. In fact, there are times when it's good for us to spend time in solitude. And so for us to be able to hold securely when we are isolated, when we feel all alone, or when we are by ourselves, having come together and held this securely and be reminded of the hope that we have in God, that can help us power through those times of loneliness, those times of isolation, those times when we don't think anybody else is there with us. And we're reminded here that we can hold on to this hope because God keeps his promises. God is a promise keeper, and we hold on to that. God is a promise keeper. And so as we move here into verse 24, he says, let us think of ways to motivate one another. So this phrase, think of ways, let us think of ways to motivate one another. Or other translations, let us consider how we can motivate, or let's be considerate. So what the writer of Hebrews wants us to remember here is that in our relationship with God, there is a reciprocal nature to it. It's not just about me. It's not just about me. It's about me and you. And so one of the things that I have said is that we are responsible for each other's discipleship. We are responsible for each other's discipleship. Now, of course, we're not 100% responsible for another person's discipleship or spiritual formation. That burden doesn't lie on us alone. But we do play a part in the discipleship of each other. You know, our own concern, our own discipleship is not our only concern. We are to look at those around us. So when you think about your Christian community that you're a part of, or here at Bethlehem, as we look around on a Sunday morning and we see people, we should take into consideration the discipleship of those people. How can we encourage them? How can we help them? And so just a couple of thoughts just come to mind. One is that we find ways to actually serve them. We find ways to help them in their time of need. We find ways to encourage them, right? We look for those opportunities to do that. A second way is that we begin to become comfortable with talking about the ways that God is working in our lives. Like when we feel discouraged, when we feel depressed, one of the things that has happened is we lose focus of those things that God has done for us. We lose focus of what God is doing in this world. We forget about the different ways that God has worked in our lives. And when we hear about God's activity, when we hear about how God is working in the lives of others, that reminds us of how God has worked in our lives. It opens our eyes to, yes, God is working in this world. And that way we can encourage one another. We can motivate one another to do what God has called us to do, not to give up, to hold on securely to this hope that we have in Jesus. And then in verse 25, where he says, and let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another. I think this is a tough one for our culture, because we have made being part of a church kind of as a secondary thing, because we've put primary, especially for us who follow Jesus, right? We've made primary our own discipleship, our own time with God. And so a lot of us who follow after Jesus have made a priority, a daily practice of prayer, of Bible study, Bible reading, of doing some sort of spiritual discipline like that. And in that, we feel comfortable and secure, like, yeah, I have a relationship with God. In the process, we have allowed other things in this world to come in and squeeze out our time with other Christians. And we haven't made church, our Sunday or weekend services or worship time a priority in our lives. If something else is happening on a Sunday morning, we're more than willing to go and do that. We only attend quote unquote church if we don't have anything else going on. And the same can be said with small groups and all of this, that these times of coming together and meeting together has become optional. And that is why, as far as when studies are done about regular church attendance, now you attend church regularly if you attend 1.5 times a month. 1.5 times a month. Now, can you really say that you are committed to this Christian community? Can you really say that you are part of this church, that you're connected there, if all you're doing is attending 1.5 times a month? And it's hard for us to hear this because what's taking us away from church is oftentimes good things. And we can convince ourselves like, hey, I can worship God here or there. I can listen to this worship music. I can read this devotional book. I can listen to this podcast. I can do this and this. And I still getting this input of Christian inspirational stuff into my life. But what you're missing out on, and what we're missing out on, what the church in the United States is missing out on, is being connected, being committed to a local church where we're finding ways, thinking of ways, finding ways of encouraging one another, motivating one another, encouraging one another. And now we wonder, well, why is the church shrinking in the United States? Why are people walking away? Why aren't we converting people to Christianity? Well, it's because we haven't made this a priority in our lives. We haven't made this a commitment. And we can say all we want, that we are a member here, we attend here, we can do this, we can do that. But if you're not showing up, if you are not present within the Christian community, then you're not really connected there. Right? You can say that, oh, I'm friends with this person here. But if you're never spending time with that person, are you really friends? You may be really good acquaintances, but a real feeling of connectedness with this person doesn't really exist. And we need to find ways to be connected. We need to find ways to not neglect meeting with one another. Now, when I was a youth pastor, one of the things that I did was that we had a Bible study on Wednesday evening. We did a prayer breakfast on Thursday morning, and then we had youth group on Thursday evenings, or on Sunday evenings. So Bible study Wednesday, prayer group on Thursday, youth group on Sunday, in addition to regular Sunday school and stuff on Sunday morning. And one of the reasons why I did that was because we had a number of people, a number of high school students who were working. They couldn't make it to Sunday morning or Sunday evening for these big times together. But by having these different opportunities for people to be a part of, they could at least find one time during the week that they could come and be plugged in. And I think that is why it's important when we're talking about don't neglect meeting together, that we find ways, and as church families, we find ways in addition to Sunday morning worship, which isn't really a good time for being connected and relationship building to happen, that we find additional times for people to come and be a part of so that they can meet together. And you need to find ways to be part of a small group or part of other things that the local church is doing so you can be connected there and you can show up, that you can be present, because that is crucial to our spiritual development, to our discipleship. There's no substitute for presence within a community. There's no substitute to presence in the community. Yeah, you may not be able to be there all the time. But eventually, if you don't make that a priority, if you're only showing up 1.5 times a month, you're not going to feel connected. You're not going to truly be part of that community. I think this is a message that we as Americans need to hear, that for our discipleship, whether it's our personal discipleship or if it's our disciple making, doing what Jesus has asked us to do, that requires our presence within a Christian community, that we make that a commitment in our lives, and that we're there through the ups and downs, through the messiness, through the successes, as well as the failures. Like, hey, we're going to be committed to this group of people. I think that's crucial for being part of God's covenant people. This is a commitment that we're going to make. Hey, thank you for being part of Afterthoughts today. And I hope that you have a great rest of the week. We'll see you next week. God bless.